Good morning, everyone. Once again, my name is José Shen. I'm one of the research fellows of the Regional Center for Europe of the Lancet Countdown. And today I'm going to give you an overview of what this initiative is and what are these indicators that we are developing. So let's get started. So the Lancet Countdown emerged in 2009 with this piece that was published in the Lancet. The Lancet is a medical journal that is quite known in the medical world. And there's this piece that talked about the health effects of climate change. And we framed climate change as the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. And since 2015, and regularly, there are reports that have been published with a set of indicators that are developed to track the progress that we are doing in the interlink between health and climate change. And this has been done globally, regularly, but also regionally. And there are 6 different regional centers. And today I'm going to focus on the European Regional Center. This is the team of the European Regional Center. It's led by 2 people, Professor Catherine Tonna, based in IS Global, and Professor Joachim Rocklove, based in Heidelberg University. There are also 2 chairs, Professor Maria Nielsen and Professor Josep Maria Antó, who also is present in this call. And then we have working group leads for each of the areas that we are working on. Professor Jan Semenza, Professor Anil Markandia and Dr. Hanna Klauber, then Professor Nihir Dasandi, and Professor Slava Jankin from Birmingham University. Then there's also 2 research fellows that we already presented and observers from the WHO, and also an advisor, Dr. Kim van Dalen, who was a former research fellow. But this is only the team who supervises and coordinates the direction of the report and the initiative in the region. We are backed with more than 50 researchers that contribute regularly to our report and the indicators that we showcase in this report. So the research collaborative, it's much more than us. It's made up with these researchers from across the region, from different research institutions. And this is our approach. We are divided in 5 groups. I already presented the working group leads that coordinate each one of these groups. The climate change impacts, exposures, and vulnerabilities is coordinated by Professor Joachim Rocklove. The second working group, adaptation, planning, and resilience for health, is coordinated by Professor Jan Semenza. The third, mitigation actions and health co-benefits, coordinated by Professor Catherine Tonna. Then economics and finance, coordinated by Professor Anil Markandia and Dr. Anna Klauber. And working group 5, politics and governance, coordinated by Professor Nihir Dasandi and Professor Slava Yankin. And I'm going to go over each one of the working groups so that you can get an overview and the specific indicators that are within each of the working groups, so that you can also understand the linkages between the different working groups. For instance, we here have the heat-related mortality, and in working group 4, we have also an indicator related to heat exposure in labor, in the occupational settings. So here we have 5 groups. The heat and health group, which has different indicators, one related to physical activity, for instance, heat-related mortality, and many others. We then have the extreme events and health, which include the wildfire, smoke, and drought. Then the group related to climate-sensitive infectious diseases, which include, for instance, climate suitability for malaria, dengue, leishmaniasis, etc. Then the allergens, allergenic trees, and food and water, which includes food security and undernutrition. And as an example, I'll give you the example of the heat-related mortality. It's one of our indicators. And our finding shows that the heat-related mortality rate increased by 17.2 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants in Europe in the last 10 years compared to the previous decade. And you can also see that the increase in mortality is almost twice as high in women compared to men. So you can see in the right women, and which is much darker than the one in the left for men. And you can also see the differences between the subregions in the Southern Europe, the Northern Europe, but also within the countries. For instance, here in Spain, there are regions which are darker than others. For working group 2, related to adaptation, we have two main groups. The one related to planning and assessment, which includes vulnerability and adaptation assessments, risk assessments, but also adaptation plans for health. And then the delivery, so the delivery and implementation, which includes the climate information for health, the green space, and also air conditioning benefits and harms. And as an example, I'll showcase the climate information for health, which comes from a WHO Health and Climate Change Global Survey report. And it shows that from the 22 reporting countries from Europe that have health surveillance systems for specific health outcomes, only a few incorporate climate information. And you can see here the different conditions, for instance, vector-borne diseases, that only 10 out of the 22 include, there's a yes, that includes climate information in the health surveillance systems. And this is quite important. For instance, in the vector-borne diseases, we know that the vectors are quite susceptible and they vary their dissemination rate, but also reproduction rate according to the climate conditions. So it's quite important to combine these two areas and understand the interlinkage between them. And we've seen as well, for instance, for extreme events in the last working group, also food security. So there are a few indicators that are connected with working group 1. And here you see how the adaptation tools in practice are being developed and are including climate or not. So there's a long way to go still in health. For working group 3, related to mitigations and health co-benefits, we have 5 main groups. The first related to energy systems. So for instance, coal phase out, the carbon intensity of the energy system, but also renewables and zero carbon emissions and electricity. And then air pollution and health co-benefits, for instance, premature mortality attributable to PM 2.5, but also the production and consumption-based attribution of CO2 and PM 2.5 emissions. And we shouldn't forget the importance of healthy and sustainable transport, which is one of our indicators, but also food, agriculture, and health, and how sustainable diets, for instance, are contributing to mitigating climate change. And last but not least, the health sector emissions and harms. And this is the one I chose to showcase to you, how the different healthcare sectors across the region have been contributing to the carbon emissions across the region. And you can see here in the graph the relation between the healthy life expectancy at birth and the per capita healthcare sector greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see here on the left the lower emitters, and on the right, more up here, the higher emitters. And you can see that for more or less the same healthy life expectancy at birth, that you have a few countries that are higher emitters, like Belgium, Cyprus, Germany, and then a few that are lower emitters, Spain, France, Sweden, Greece, Portugal, Italy. And you can see very well that there's a gap here that can be bridged, that you can basically decrease the emissions without losing healthy life expectancy at birth. That shows that there's a long way for these health systems to work towards decarbonizing and reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. This indicator also shows that there was a 3% per capita increase in greenhouse gas emissions in 2020 compared with 2010, and that this contributes in 2020 to 540,000 disability adjusted life years, which is quite a heavy burden. So for economics and finance, there are two main groups. I'm not going to get much into them, but first is the health-linked economic impacts of climate change and its mitigation, and then the economics of the transition to zero carbon economies. And Dr. Hannah Klauber will further explain in detail the indicators of this working group. And finally, I'll talk a bit about the fifth working group, which is the public and political engagement. We have 5 groups as well. The first related to scientific engagement with health and climate change. For instance, the coverage of these two areas in scientific articles, but also of the health impacts of the anthropogenic climate change. The second one is related to individual engagement with these two fields on social media. Then the political engagement, both in the European Parliament, but also in social media. Then the corporate sector engagement. And finally, the media engagement with health and climate change. So the indicator that we brought to you today in this working group is related to the coverage of climate change and health in scientific articles. And our findings, as it shows here in this graph, is that the scientific evidence is increasing over time with a small drop from 2021 to 2022. But one thing that we notice is that most of the evidence that is developed is very focused still in the health impacts, with only 15 articles, that means 44%, that are focused on mitigation, and 16, meaning 5%, on adaptation. So here there's a gap that's clearly showing that we need to focus on in developing further information for these areas. And then you can also see on the right the number of papers mentioning subnational locations, and you see a lot of spots in Italy, in Spain, in the UK, and a few in Germany, and then a bit more dispersed across the rest of Europe. And now I'm going to pass on the word to Dr. Hannah Klauber, who will further explain the indicators that are present in the working group 4. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, José. I will proceed and give a high-level overview of the economics and finance chapter of the Lancet Countdown Europe. Across Europe, this chapter basically seeks to cover the economic costs of climate change and its drivers. This could cover financial damages linked to extreme weather events, for instance, but also economic risks that are tied to the continued reliance on fossil fuels. And this chapter also monitors investments and economic tools that are being deployed to move toward a low-carbon economy, shedding light on investments in clean energy, for instance, or the use of carbon pricing mechanisms. José already shared an overview like this, which shows the indicators that are included in the chapter. I would like to at least mention 6 of them, which are listed here. The first one looks at the temperature impacts on labor supply. This indicator basically measures how longer-term changes in temperature impact working hours supplied by workers in high occupation high exposure outdoor occupations, combining data on working hours and data on temperature. Then we have a second indicator that looks at the impacts of temperature anomalies on GDP per capita growth, with temperature anomalies being defined at differences in today's temperatures compared to average temperatures in a historic reference period. We have an indicator that estimates the monetized value of mortality attributable to unhealthy diets. There is an indicator that calculates the economy-wide average net carbon revenues and prices by subtracting fossil fuel subsidies from carbon price revenues. We have an indicator that tracks energy investments in Europe, comparing how much goes into clean energy, how much goes into fossil fuels. And then last but not least, an indicator that monitors climate-related development finance from European donor countries and philanthropic sources, focusing on funds with climate change adaptation as the principal objective. And these indicators are based on various data sets using different methods, and we don't have the time to go into detail on all of them here in this webinar today, but I do want to highlight two of them to give you a clearer sense of how these indicators look like in practice. Okay, so let's take a closer look at this first indicator, which measures how temperature changes impact labor supply. This indicator was developed and is updated by Professor Elizabeth Robinson and Dr. Shuro Dasgupta, who are also here today if they didn't have to leave yet. And they are the experts behind this indicator. So if you have very specific questions, they are the right persons to ask about it. But why is this indicator important? We know that increasing heat stress directly harms the health of workers, especially those working in high exposure occupations, outdoor occupations like agriculture, mining, and construction. And this indicator tracks long-term temperature changes, tracks how these long-term temperature changes impact labor supply among workers in these occupations at a subnational level across Europe. And to do this, the authors use data on labor supply from the European Labor Force Survey at the NUTS2 level and combine it with data from the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts. This is a data product called ERA5 Land, including information on temperature and precipitation. And then these data are analyzed in a panel fixed effects model, which essentially exploits annual variation in temperature within NUTS2 areas to link these temperature changes to changes in the number of supplied working hours. And this estimated relationship between temperature changes and labor supply is then combined with longer-term temperature changes to capture how warming trends over time have impacted labor supply. And in this map here, the findings are illustrated very nicely. On the left, these maps here show the percentage change in labor supply for the mentioned high exposure occupations, changes that are linked to temperature shifts compared to a historic baseline. So in the left, we have the look at the period 1995 to 2000, and this other map here shows the period 2016 to 2020, both in comparison to a historic reference period. And what it shows is, well, in red shaded areas indicate areas where labor supply has decreased over time, whereas green shaded areas indicate increases in labor supply. And we can see that there is quite some geographic heterogeneity in the effects. And it seems that these differences across regions have also increased over time when we compare these two maps here next to each other. Another indicator that I would like to highlight is the indicator on the net value of fossil fuel subsidies and carbon prices. This indicator is authored by Dr. Daniel Scammon, and the rationale behind this indicator is that if we have carbon prices that adequately reflect the external costs that are linked to greenhouse gas emissions, then we can internalize the costs of climate change into economic decision-making. So by creating economic incentives through carbon prices, we can better move toward a low carbon economy. At least we have the economic incentives to do this. However, there are many European countries, governments that continue to subsidize fossil fuels, which not only weakens these price signals, but also increases health-harming emissions. So this indicator calculates the net carbon revenues and prices by subtracting fossil fuel subsidies from carbon price revenues. And importantly, it represents an economy-wide average of the net carbon revenues and prices. So for instance, not reflecting sector-specific heterogeneity. In 2020, this indicator showed that of the 53 WHO European region countries that were analyzed, 32 had some form of carbon pricing in place, but 29 of those countries had a net negative carbon price, meaning that they were still providing net subsidies to fossil fuels. And there were only 14 countries with net positive carbon prices, which effectively discouraged the use of fossil fuels. And on the right, this figure here illustrates the findings of this indicator, showing the net carbon prices, the net carbon revenues, and also the net carbon revenues as a fraction of national health expenditures for the WHO regions in 2020. Now, many dimensions of the intersection of economics, finance, climate change, and health are not covered by these indicators, which is also a difficult objective to achieve. And here we would like to highlight some broad areas where we see there are still gaps that could be filled that open up space for the development of new indicators. The first gap area relates to health-linked economic impacts of climate change, which we think could be assessed more systematically. This includes, for instance, tracking the economic costs of both mortality but also morbidity linked to exposures such as heat exposure, air pollution, and extreme weather events. Secondly, we currently have no indicator that tracks the spendings on disaster impacts, responses to disasters, and recovery. The chapter previously included an indicator that tracked the insured and uninsured losses from natural disasters, but unfortunately, the underlying database is no longer available, which is why we are looking for new indicators that track these losses. It would be great to have indicators that identify regions, pinpoint regions with low insurance coverage, and also to find out how and when payouts are triggered after catastrophic events. And then third, we think there's room to better capture the distributional impacts of climate change. So targeting the question, who bears the economic and health costs linked to climate change impacts both within countries, looking, for instance, at different socioeconomic group, but also between countries. The second gap area concerns the transition towards zero carbon economies. Here, I would like to highlight two, I think, complementary needs. The first comes with a backward-looking perspective. So it would be great here to have indicators that ex post quantify the effects of climate policies that have been implemented in the past to find out how successful they were, if they led to health benefits, for instance. Thinking of improved air quality linked to climate policies, policies that encourage healthier diets, better urban designs to quantify what the economic benefits of these impacts are, but then also to shed light on potentially adverse side effects policies may have created. And then in addition to this ex post perspective, it would be great to also have indicators that take on a forward-looking perspective, exploring future economic scenarios under different mitigation and adaptation strategies, indicators that better integrate health impacts into damage functions, which are used in integrated assessment models, which would then allow us to better reflect health impacts in long-term projections. And then I would like to highlight one third gap area, which relates to health-enabling financial flows. A key question here is how we can better capture differences in financial capacity and access to finance across different population groups. For instance, when we think of households, They may need affordable loans or targeted subsidies to make the switch to cleaner energies. And without these mechanisms, the transition might risk leaving some parts of the population behind. And it will also be interesting, we think, to have indicators that measure the engagement of economic institutions, such as banks, pension funds, or hedge funds, to assess to what extent they are already addressing the economic costs and risks associated with climate change in their daily business. And now, of course, this is not an exhaustive list, and developing indicators to solve all these gaps is also not trivial, because we need good databases that are reliable, regularly updated, that ideally cover all of Europe. And we also need to have robust methods that allow us to produce results that are meaningful, but also comparable over time, allowing us to track changes, to track progress made over time. But I think this is exactly why we set up this seminar, to get started discussing what the challenges are, what potential data sets are that could be interesting in filling some of these gaps. And I think this leads us perfectly into our planned open exchange, where at this point we would be interested in hearing your thoughts, your perspectives. Do you already maybe have ideas for new indicators that could either fill some of the gaps that I have outlined or address other health-linked economic dimensions of climate change? Which of the missing indicators do you find most relevant and in need of prioritization? And how does your own research or professional work relate to potential indicators that could be developed? And you're, of course, also free to ask other questions, make comments, and raise suggestions. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to now delve in a bit back to the report, and specifically about the 2027 report. And we are currently starting the preparations for this report. We start 1.5 years in advance, as you can see, because there's a lot to prepare, a lot to discuss. And if you're interested as well, also a lot to contribute. So I'm going to go over the indicator development process in general, how you can propose your ideas, and how the submission of proposals, our white papers, go about. So we currently have an open call for submissions of white papers until the 16th of October. So you have around 1 month and a bit to think about something and then propose it. And how can you do this, and what's the process? So we develop indicators and at the Lancet Countdown, and specifically for Europe, since we are the regional center at the European level. And our indicators are measurable and quantitative variables that we use to track and monitor the trends in climate change and health over time. And this is useful to inform decision-making, interventions, and policy. So we have data that goes around across Europe, and then sub-regions, and then country level as well. So we develop a few country data sheets as well with the specific indicators, a few selected ones for depending on the context. And our indicators have to fulfill the following criteria. They have to be meaningful, relevant, scientifically sound and reproducible, temporarily and geographically representative, and also from reliable and updatable data sources. And what do I mean with meaningful? Meaningful means that the indicator should track an aspect of both climate change and health, and trying to focus on the relationship between these two. So we, as much as we can, we try to have the interplay between the two, and to be included in our report. And then it should be relevant to policy and decision makers, or represent an important contribution in the development and knowledge of these two fields. It should be scientifically sound and reproducible. That means that the indicators must use a well-established, internationally accepted, and scientifically published method. So there's a clear description of the methodology. You might or might not have published it yourself before, and then scale it to the whole region. Or if you develop for the whole region, you can also scale it down for the different countries, but your methodology has been published or has been used before. And with temporarily representative, I mean that the data should monitor the dimension that we are tracking across time. So for instance, we have here the climate suitability for West Nile virus, and you can see that we have data that spans across a few decades that allows us to monitor across time and across the different regions. And that's the geographically representativeness. So this is a time series from 1960 to 2023. And with geographically representative, we mean that it should be available at the country level or higher level of resolution, meaning the NUTS regions that we have in Europe that you can see here are subnational levels of disaggregation, so higher level of resolution. And these are based to the European Environmental Agency member and cooperating countries, which are, and the United Kingdom, which are 38 countries. And we try to focus on having data for these 38 countries. And then we also aim to expand more and more because the WHO European region has 53 countries plus Liechtenstein and Kosovo. So we aim at expanding it. But of course, if it's not possible and if we don't have the data for it, we stick to the bare minimum that we try to have, which are the 38 from the EEA and the UK. And you can see here the 38 countries, which also include, for instance, a few of the Baltics, the UK, which is currently not part of the EEA, yeah, and Norway, for instance, as well. And then the indicator should also be reliable and from updatable sources. That means sources that are publicly available, especially those that are developed by international organizations. For instance, Eurostat has a rich database for population, mortality, and other variables. Also, WHO has a few databases, OECD, other governmental bodies, even your own country level specific statistics that you can retrieve for the different countries. And then also, of course, some that are hosted in academic institutions from different projects. For instance, there are a few related also with the Lancet Countdown, Catalyze, ID Alert, and they do develop and also expands, and they do develop a few databases as well. Then private databases with unclear methodology and biased methodologies should be avoided. We want everything to be public, to be reliable. Of course, you can explain the methodology and present to us, but the preferable is the public available databases so that your indicator can also be reproducible, can also be reliable on the data that we are basing the indicator on, and that the data sources that are publicly available are also kept up to date. So, for instance, Eurostat collects data from countries every year and sometimes every week. For instance, the weekly mortality or regularly. They do keep it up to date. So this is the ideal scenario to develop an indicator because these data sources are constantly getting new data across time. And a few of the data sources that I can show you, for instance, ERA5 and ERA5 land, has Hannah already presented before and mentioned before, is one of the main climate data sources that we use in terms of temperature, for instance, that we have in the Lancet Countdown. Population data often comes from the Eurostat because for Europe, it has a lot of data that can also be disaggregated on subnational levels. We can also rely on a few survey information that are collected. For instance, we have the WHO survey that goes on regularly, and because it's from WHO, it's hosted and is conducted regularly, we can rely on it. But there are others that are available. For instance, the Eurobarometer that can also be used. It's regular and it's hosted. The standard edition is hosted regularly and continuously. Then we can also rely on language models and other data sources. And here in the scheme, you can see a few of the indicators and the different variables and gridded reanalysis sources that contribute to the different hazards that are in working group 1 and exposures, and then the population data that basically connects, is used overall in the different working groups. So how do you propose an indicator? So the first step that you have to do is to have an idea and propose that idea to the respective working group lead by email. So you can reach out by email to us. You can even ask us beforehand. So what is your idea for the indicator you want to develop? How would you develop? What's the methodology behind it? Just a rough idea of the indicator that you're planning to submit. So if it's related to climate change impacts, exposures, and vulnerabilities, contact Professor Joachim Rocklove. If it's related to adaptation, planning, and resilience for health, Professor Jan. If it's mitigation, actions, and health co-benefits, Professor Catherine Toner. If it's economics and finance, and I hope after this webinar you can reach out to us, to Professor Anil and Professor Hannah. Here are their emails. Then if it's politics and governance, you can reach out to Professor Slava and Professor Nihir. After you present their idea, there will be a round of discussions back and forth to understand how consistent is your indicator and if it fulfills all the criteria that I described before. And if your proposal is convincing enough and the criteria is fulfilled by the indicator that you are proposing, you are invited to submit a white paper. So a white paper, basically, it's a proposal form that you fill in. There's a few sections that basically explain why your indicator is relevant, how you're developing it, so the methodology, what are the time and geographical coverage, also a few inequality dimensions, and also a few caveats. So what are the limitations and how you plan to improve the indicator in the future. So this is then follow up. So you propose the indicator to the working group leads. Then there's a discussion on how the indicator is strong enough to be and it fulfills the criteria. And then you can submit the white paper. And step 3 after these 2 steps is to submit the white paper. So fill in the white paper template, which I already briefly described. Basically what's in this slide. Describe the indicator, the relationship between climate change and health in Europe. How does it fit the working group? Because sometimes you think that it might fit, for instance, working group 3, and it might fit working group 2, or maybe if it does have a economics and finance dimension, it will fit working group 4. Then describe the methodology, the data sources, the data that is available, and the coverage in terms of geographics and time-wise. And then provide a mock-up of how the indicator will be reported. So you can even showcase with a table, with a map, a data visualization item, how the data will be shown in the report, so that we can have a rough idea of the possibilities and the data that you have according to the white paper. And then describe the caveats and the future improvements, as I said. And last step, after the white paper is submitted, we have to revise it. We go through an internal and external peer review, if necessary, of the proposed indicator. So, and this happens after the submission, so between the October and December of this year. And then we provide you feedback on the final decision of the white paper that you submitted by January. So these are the different steps. I hope it was clear. If you have any questions, you can always drop us an email. I will put the slides again of the different emails that you can take, so that you can take note of. But we can also share it by email after the webinar if you allow us to. And yeah, if you have any questions, reach out. If you have any ideas for indicators for any of the working groups, please reach out and propose your idea.